Okay, everyone, welcome into the space. Welcome to this time. I want to point your attention to the pinned comment, which will take you to, I hope, some more information about some offerings for the BIPOC community between now, within the next 2 weeks. So, awesome. Thank you, everyone, for coming in. I was going to give it another 1.5 minutes just to let people kind of land in this space. And this video will be posted on my timeline. Okay? And so it'll just be accessible afterwards, right? And so feel free to share and to do whatever you like to do with the video afterwards, okay? Please just let me know where you're signing in from. I see some UK folks. Thank you so much for joining. It's about 5 o'clock in the UK, so it's tea time. So just another minute to just let us start getting to there. I see my mother. Praise the Lord, Reverend. It's good to see you in the space. We have some Atlanta folks, some New York City folks, Maryland, Phoenix, a Phoenician there, from occupied Ohlone land, yeah. Kenya, Germany, Chicago. And as we began, I'm living on and teaching from the ancestral lands of the Muskogee, Creek, and Cherokee people here in Atlanta as well. So Cleveland, India, Denver, West Virginia. Always a good shout out to all my southern folks, southern United States folks. From Wappinger land, that's my old land, Wappinger Falls, Knoxville, okay. Now, we're gonna, be exploring grief from, a BIPOC perspective. And, quite frankly, I don't know who's in the room. So anyone can be here, just be respectful of the space that's being created. So that's my only kind of ask, right? Because I really can't control who's in, right? But just be respectful of the space. That's all. So I want to start this time with just a kind of an incense offering. And this is something that I often do in practice. If you practice with me in any other online space or in-person space, I like to offer incense. And in this moment, I'm offering incense particularly to first my ancestors. So offer these incense to my ancestors. It is so much of the grief that I hold and carry is also the grief of my ancestors, and I offer this as a recognition for what they hold and what we hold together, and I pray that this incense offering will help to alleviate the suffering that they're experiencing. If you have incense or something like that, I invite you to light this with me as well, because it creates a different kind of energy in the space. When I begin to work with the energy of grief, I have to create a space that can hold the practice of grieving, right? And this is one of the first things that I do. I offer to the beings around me, so including my ancestors, but I want to also offer this incense to the physical land, the earth, right? As an offering to the earth, as a recognition of the ways in which the earth is taking care of all of us right now. And I dedicate this incense to the beings, the unseen beings connected to this land, whom I call the local gods, the local deities. I make this offering to them as a recognition of their importance, their necessity here on this land. And I offer it to the beings who actually want to create harm. Those beings, dark forces, beings lost in their own trauma and hate, who create harm for us and for themselves. I dedicate this offering to them, and I pray that this incense offering can pacify their suffering, so that the harm that they create for themselves and the harm that they create for us in our world can be disrupted. It's so important that we remember the beings of the unseen world around us as we enter into a relationship with working with grief. I want you to, as we begin this time, which will be a little bit of talk, a little bit of practice, and I want to have some space at the end of the hour for questions, that you may have. But as we begin, I just invite you to arrive in the space that you're in. And I know that we're all in very different spaces. Some of us are in public, maybe some of us are at work, some of us are just busy doing other things and tuning in. But whatever you're doing, whatever is happening, I just invite you just to remember that you have a body, right? And that you're connected to the earth, right? That the earth is holding you. And because the earth is holding you, I want you to know and understand that the earth, the land, is also loving you. And caring for you. And I invite you to connect to that experience of care in this moment. Again, no matter what you're doing, connecting to the care of the earth that's rising to meet you. And if you're sitting on something, I'm sitting on a little couch here, I'm also connecting to the care of what it means to sit on this couch, to have this couch, the seat, rise to take care of me. And this is important for us, because for those of us coming out of, particularly marginalized communities, right? Sometimes what we struggle with is not feeling as if anything or anyone is caring for us, right? And this is the part of systematic oppression, that creates the illusion that no one cares. And if we don't feel as if we're cared for, then it's going to be really hard for us to feel as if we're resourced enough to disrupt the harm, right, that we're experiencing, right? So when I go through this process of connecting to the earth, connecting to the seed, I am trying to reestablish the experience of care for myself. And that experience of care becomes a foundation that helps me to lean into the energy of grief, right? I can lean into the energy of grief because I feel as if there's something caring for me, that I'm not doing this on my own. And what I also feel is the support of my ancestors, right, in whom we collaborate together to alleviate this experience of suffering, and particularly in the form of transhistorical grief and transhistorical trauma. There's also transhistorical rage, as well, as I've talked about before. So connecting to this experience of care, which is this experience of really having the resources to begin to consume the intensity of the grief. And that's a lot of grief right now. So as we move forward, keeping these sources of refuge really close, right? And I call this time, grieving the impossible grief, because for many of us, this experience of grief seems to be overwhelming. And the overwhelming experience actually is this experience of being consumed by the grief, as if we're drowning in the grief, right? And we say, well, there's no way for me to do anything about this because everything is happening. The world is changing. We're in the midst of this apocalypse, right? It's getting harder to gather the basic resources that we need to be well, right? And on top of that, people are creating harm, right? Even more harm for us through the decisions that they're making, right? To restrict other people, including ourselves, from the basic resources of being able to name ourselves, being able to choose the kind of care that we need, right? And it becomes frustrating and overwhelming, right? And then that turns into this kind of grief, because at the heart of everything, grief is the experience of loss, of change. Everything is changing, and when everything changes, or when I lose someone or something that's been deeply important to me, I go through this period of struggling to figure out who I am, right? So this is why we keep coming back to these experiences of care from the earth, from our ancestors, from our communities. When I think about grief and care from, my perspective as a Black, queer, cisgender person who experiences multiple intersections of systematic oppression, the thing that drives the work that I do to take care of myself is my relationship, my belonging to the communities that I come from, right? It's not just me, right? It's not just me going through this, it's us going through this. And it's not just us in this moment, but it's been us in the past. It's been our ancestors, right, who've carried these experiences of grief and trauma and anger through their lifetimes, right? And then we are expressed in the physical form, in the physical realm, as an expression of our ancestors, right? And not just our familial ancestors, not just our blood ancestors, but the communities, again, that we're a part of. My queer ancestry, right? My indigenous ancestry, right? The people who worked and struggled and lived in such a way that they created the causes and conditions for me to be in the world right now, doing the things that are important for me. Those are my ancestors, right? And to remember the struggle, and to remember that we're a continuation of that struggle, right? But it is also, as a continuation of the struggle of holding the grief, is also so much of our work to let go of it, right? To begin to rely on sources of refuge like the earth, others around us, to begin to call in the help that we need to start experiencing something different, right? So it's difficult, right, in Black and brown and indigenous bodies to work with just individual grief, right? Because again, it's not just our grief, it's the grief of our communities, it's the grief of our ancestors, right? It's also the grief of our descendants as well, who have come before, who are coming after us. And it's the grief that is perpetuated and intensified by systems of violence and oppression that, disproportionately target us. So there's so much to survive here, right? And this is why it becomes a grief that feels impossible to grieve. So again, I'm reminding you to connect to the earth, to connect to the seat, connect to ancestors who are coming forward right now to tend to you, to take care of you. I want you to really connect to care right now, to be cared. What does it feel like to be cared for in this moment? By the seat, by the earth, by the ancestors. What does it feel like to be cared for by me in this moment? Right? To know that we are not the only ones experiencing this heaviness, this intensity. And that sense of isolation or aloneness actually will intensify the experience of grief, right? When we start believing I am the only one, right? If we're the only one, then it becomes a special kind of punishment for us. When in fact, grief is a universal experience that people are experiencing, of course, in different degrees and levels, right? But for those of us coming from and surviving through experiences of systematic oppression, then that experience of grief is actually quite compounded. And so much of my practice over the years has been learning how to actually open up to the care around me, the care from the earth, the care from my ancestors, the care from deities and spirits and angels and whomever. Right? I'll take it from anywhere, right? And for us, for Black, brown, indigenous folks, right, because of the trauma of systematic oppression, we find it really difficult to actually open to the care that we need in order to survive. It's hard for us to trust and open. Because what surviving oppression means is that we have to shut down, we have to close down in order to survive. If we can shrink, right, and shut down, then we can get through the violence of what we have to endure. And it seems extremely counterintuitive to be told that actually the path of liberation is actually to open, particularly here, right in the heart center, to begin to open, to begin to connect to this experience of space. But not just connecting to space, but connecting to a space that is full of beings, benefactors, who are trying to tend to us. Opening to the experience of community and elders who are actually resourced enough to take care of us, to tend to us. I think one of the particular tenets of colonialism is actually creating this narrative of isolation. If people who are being colonized are isolated, then they lose strength, they lose power. But when we start remembering solidarity, First, solidarity with myself, allying with myself, being in solidarity with myself, then being in solidarity with my immediate community, then creating a sense of solidarity or experience of solidarity with other communities of folks who mirror the experiences of my primary community, right? That begins to reverse this particular tenet of colonialism, right? But also, another tenet of colonialism is distrust. So we're also taught to distrust ourselves, to distrust parts of our communities and other communities that reflect our struggle. So I can't trust others, I can't trust other communities, nor can I enter into any kind of sustainable solidarity until I start working on trusting myself. Trusting myself that I can actually be free, that I can actually begin to grieve the grief that initially feels impossible. That this grief, from a Buddhist Tantra perspective, this grief is just an expression of my mind, and my mind is already free, right? And I just am working to remember that I'm already free, right? If I can just practice enough to connect to the clarity, right, and this experience of care that's already very present, if I can just get to the clarity, everything begins to awaken, right? For many of us, we are people who have only forgotten who we are, but who we are is still there. Like, I'm still a liberated person. I'm still an awakened being, right? I maybe have forgotten that, but my spiritual practice is actually about remembering. Right? And for those of you who practice mindfulness, right, the four foundations of mindfulness, the satipatthana, right, the practice of remembering, right, remembering who we are. Mindfulness isn't about trying to be efficient and trying to be happy and trying to get along with people, right? Mindfulness is actually about remembering who I am. And when I remember who I am, it's often, I find it very difficult to be, to kind of go along with all the bullshit, right? So mindfulness isn't a practice about becoming agreeable. Mindfulness is a practice about becoming who I am. Remembering my awakenedness, my liberatedness, if you can say that, right? Right. So when I am leaning into this experience of grief, I always ask myself, what does this feel like? Right? Like, what does grief feel like in my mind? What does grief feel like in my body? It's because to begin to remember who you are, you have to start naming what's happening, right? And I have to develop the courage to name what's happening for me, or I can never get free. We can't ever get free from something that remains nameless. It's not how any of this works. I have to start naming everything. So you start naming that. What does this feel like? Where is this experience of grief for me? And this is how we begin also to start consuming the grief. When I say consume, what I mean is that, first of all, I am disidentifying or unidentifying with the grief itself. I am not grieving. I am not grieving. I instead am experiencing grief, right? right? And this is I know this is such a nuanced statement here, but I am experiencing something, but this isn't who I am. Like, I can be pissed off, but that's really not the truth, right? I'm experiencing anger, but I am not the anger. So when we start talking about grief, thinking about grief, first of all, grief is just an experience. It's not who I am. And this is the first thing that we have to start doing, right? Actually, the first thing we have to start doing is connecting to care, right? But the second thing we start doing is changing the language and saying, this is just an experience. This is not who I am. My experience of grief is like clouds passing through the sky. Like, when we look up at the sky, we don't say the sky is clouds, right? The sky is open, spacious, right? If anything, it is the window into a greater experience of space beyond this planet. So this is where you start going. This is just an experience, and this experience is coming from a vast amount of space within my experience. Right? Because when we gaze at the sky, particularly on a sunny day, we're connecting also to the experience of the sun. The sun is the brilliance, the beauty, the magic, the clarity of the mind itself, which is always shining. Right? It can be an overcast day. It doesn't mean the sun isn't shining. It means it's overcast. Right? So connecting to care, right? Reminding ourselves that this is just an experience. And then thirdly, as we've talked about already, I'm reminding myself that I'm not alone in this. I am not alone. I am not the only one in the world. You know, you can take it further. I'm not the only being in the whole universe of countless beings, right, who's experiencing this change and the loss and everything that comes from trying to figure out my relationship to change and loss. I am not the only one. And just moving into that, just for however long you can hold that, right? Just reflecting on these points, right? Reflecting on care, reflecting on this being an experience, reflecting on that I am not the only one going through this. And when we have some of these practices really set, as a foundation for us, then we move into a really important part of practice for me, which is actually letting go. Letting go of the grief, letting the grief move, letting the grief dance, letting the grief do what it needs to do. But what we're really struggling with is that we're holding on to the grief because, again, we've begun to self-identify with the grief, right? And for me, identifying, as Black, right, one of the things I had to work on a lot in my past is that I kept identifying Blackness with suffering. To be Black meant that I had to struggle, that I had to suffer, right? And when I started experiencing more joy and happiness because of my practice, I felt like I was betraying Blackness, and I felt like I was betraying my community because I was experiencing joy, right? I wasn't struggling as much, right? And so when we start actually moving through these practices, letting go of the grief, then it's going to be really uncomfortable because we will begin to understand, we'll begin to see that we've started identifying with the suffering. In this case, with grief. I am someone who grieves, right? And we link that grief to identity, right? Who am I? Am I still Black and queer if I actually experience joy? And do I still belong? Coming from a place of joy rather than from a place of the trauma. Because so much of our culture, if you're coming from cultures, from Black and brown cultures and indigenous cultures, so much of our cultures, unfortunately, have started to morph into cultures of trauma and trauma expression. So what is my experience of Blackness? And sometimes my experience of Blackness can be the experience of trauma, right? To be Black is to be traumatized. And I had to disrupt that narrative. No, to be Black isn't actually to be in trauma. It's to recognize the history of struggle and liberation that my ancestors and I are engaged in. But I am not the trauma. I am actually, again, an expression of an awakened being. I am already awakened. Knowing that how we begin to use trauma as these experiences of comfort and of familiarity. And I know it's a really strange thing to call trauma comfortable, right? But trauma becomes comfortable. Any kind of suffering becomes comfortable because it's familiar. We know it. Like, I know this. Like, I know this suffering. That can be quite comforting. Like, I know the suffering. I don't know that suffering. So I'm going to choose this suffering because this is what I know. And then I would say the existential crisis that we move through is letting go of that trauma, which is also letting go of the grief, right? And then entering into this experience of space. And to be very clear, when we let go of something, it's not erased. I am never going to say erase anything. I can be, as the song says, I can be sad and free at the same time, or I can experience sadness and freedom at the same time, right? But the freedom, which is an expression of space, is actually holding the experiences of discomfort, right? Instead of the experiences of discomfort holding me. And this is what we have to change up, right? Our grief, trauma, anger are actually holding us. But in reality, we have to return back to the real view, which is that the spaciousness, the expansiveness of my mind is actually holding the discomfort, the suffering, the trauma, the grief, as well as the joy, right? And because of the expansiveness, the spaciousness of my mind, I can choose over time not to fixate on what's uncomfortable, what's suffering, right? And this is a part of the freedom work, is that I enter into agency. I can begin to choose. And many of us are not able to choose anything other than the suffering, than the grief right now. We don't feel as if, and we don't believe as if we have the agency to choose something different, right? Because the experiences of suffering, of grief in this case, are so overwhelming. But we begin to choose the joy or the gratitude or the happiness when we begin to allow ourselves to think about these experiences. And for me, gratitude is how I get into the experience of joy, right? Even when I feel as if I'm being consumed by grief, my strategy is to start actually contemplating, reflecting on what I'm grateful for. Because there's something I am grateful for. And that's going to give me the energy to start shifting my attention out of the suffering into an experience that feels more generative, more spacious, right? Even as we struggle, there's something to be grateful for, right? I think about, again, ancestry. I come from people who were enslaved, right, primarily. And what I know and understand about my ancestors was that, yes, there was intense suffering, but there was also intense joy. That joy was one of the resources that helped us to continue moving through the experiences of chattel slavery and then Jim Crow and into this period now, like that we're still experiencing, the racial violence. The joy that was really based on an understanding that this isn't all there is. Like this experience of this life in this body that we're moving through, this is just a moment, right? And what we understand, particularly in Buddhism, is the reality of impermanence, that everything's changing. Everything's changing because nothing is actually based on reality to begin with. This is a dream that we're moving through. This is not our home, right? This experience of the world and its period of apocalypse, it is just an experience that we're moving through. This is not an experience that will last forever, right? And for me to consume, to process the experiences of discomfort, I have to choose to bring attention, focus, awareness to what's happening, because if I don't pay attention to what's happening, I'll never understand how to choose freedom, even in the midst of incarceration in this time and place. You can't choose freedom or liberation when you don't know, when you don't understand. Freedom just doesn't happen, right? Freedom, both social freedom and ultimate freedom, comes with labor, right? I wish I could be like, like Dorothy, in The Wizard of Oz, or I would say Stephanie Mills or Diana Ross in The Wiz. But I'm going to say Diana Ross because I've never seen Stephanie Mills in The Wiz on Broadway. But just like being in The Wiz, and at the end, The Wiz says, well, all you have to do is click your heels together, and you're like out of this. Baby, you can go home. And I wish it was that easy for us. I wish I had some ruby slippers. Well, actually, I'll just rephrase that. I wish my ruby slippers actually had magical powers. So when I click the heels together, I would go somewhere else instead of out to the club. But that's another IG Live session. But you work. And I mean not just WORK. I mean work. WERK. Work, honey. Right? You've got to work. When I say work, I mean, how do we transform the suffering into liberation? That's the work, right? And that's the kind of work that comes out of many of our ancestries, right? We are alive because our ancestors worked. And we continue because we choose to work. Like work. And you better work, right? You work. Where's your work, honey? Show me your work. You have to get fierce. right? And when I'm working with my grief is a source of fierceness for me, right? Because it actually helps me to open my heart up to like what everyone else is experiencing, not just what I'm experiencing. Everyone's experiencing this, right? And I don't want to keep drowning in my own grief, right? So therefore I do these practices to begin to create this spaciousness. And the work that I do for myself is the work that I begin to offer back to the communities that rely on me. This is the work that I'm offering you right now. Can you get into that, right? Can you get with this work? Like, what we have to understand is that we have obligations to the communities who protect us, who watch out for us, right? We have these obligations, so it's not just me, it's us. Like, this is us. And whatever I can do for myself, I'm going to give that to the communities around me. Really different relationships to our understandings of like collective care and self-care. But in this moment, for me, and again, I just want to point this out again, so I know there's a lot of different views around this, but I can only take care of my community if I understand how to care for myself, right? But it's not just understanding how to care for myself, it's also opening to care from others. So this is two things that are happening. I'm just not trying to like just care for myself. I'm also having to open up to the care. And we talked about this at the beginning of our session, right? Trauma disrupts many of us from actually taking in the care that's being offered to us. You know? And you won't get free that way either. Right? That's a kind of selflessness that actually isn't sustainable for us. Like, we have to enter into a really clear relationship with the cycle of care. And that cycle of care means that, like, as I am offering care, care is being offered back to me, right? And maybe I have to figure out what that looks like. You know, as I said before at the beginning, the earth, the land is always caring for me. My seat is caring for me. The kind of care that we can talk about is just the ways in which the phenomenal world is trying to alleviate our suffering. You know, if there's a seat that I'm sitting on, then the seat is caring for me, right? If there's some water around me, that water is caring for me. If I'm thirsty, the air, the oxygen around us is caring for us. When I go outside into the sun is caring for me, right? The warmth is caring for me, right? Like, you have to start becoming sensitive to how the phenomenal world is organizing to care for us, and then open to that and say, yes, yeah, the seat is really caring for me. The water I'm drinking is caring for me. The bed that I sleep on is caring for me, right? This TikTok video that just like makes me laugh is caring for me, right? Everything is caring for me. How can I just open to that, right? Because that's going to become the resources that we process and then offer back to others. You know, it's like also, now I'm not like a biologist or an herbalist or anything, so I get confused when I start thinking about some of this language, but like, it's like plants take, carbon. Yeah, they take carbon. And then like they process it, and photosynthesis, I guess, is a part of this. And in any case, they produce oxygen for the rest of us to breathe, right? This is the same way that we can show up in our communities. We can begin to become sensitive to these ways in which the phenomenal world is taking care of us, right? Ways that other people aren't connecting to, and then take that care in, process it, experience some groundedness, some clarity, and then we can begin to offer it back to people in a more direct way, to people who aren't connecting to the care of the earth, but they can connect to how I'm able to show up, right? Because I am connected to the care that's being offered to me, right? This kind of photosynthesis. Listen, I'm going to stop with this language, but I have to read a little more before I get deeper into this language, right? But I take in the care and then I give it back in a way that people can register it and really work with it and connect to it. I think for those of us coming out of systematic oppression from Black, brown, and indigenous communities, we have to return back to a kind of indigeneity, right? And part of that indigeneity means that I need to get back to the fundamental, phenomenal world and start getting back into relationship with phenomena, not with systems. Not institutions, not systems, but with the phenomenal world, the natural world, right? With the water, with the mountains, with the forest, with the grass, with the dirt, with the air, with the sun. I need to be back in a fundamental relationship where I am connecting to this natural phenomena again. And so to allow that phenomena to actually tell me who I am, that I am not this system of violence, that I am instead this expression of an organic, awakened being connected to the phenomenal world and who is inherently free, right? And this is the time that we're moving back into, actually, because systems have played themselves out, right? And the phenomenal world, the natural world, is calling us back into relationship, back to the phenomenal world, also back to the unseen world. It's calling us back into prayer. It's calling us back into ritual and ceremony, right? For so long, many of us have been so preoccupied with white supremacy, and heteronormativity and anti-queerness and anti-transness. We've been in capitalism, all of it. We've been so preoccupied, and we actually need to reinvest our energy back into ourselves. Not trying to save people, and I'm going to be more specific, not, investing in energy into people and into communities that aren't doing their work to get free, but are using your resources to create this illusion that something is happening, right? But to ask ourselves, what do I need right now, and what does my immediate community need, right? And what a lot of us need to do, and this is a process that I've been working through for a while now, is that white supremacy isn't my problem, right? And I've been really confused for years because I keep being told that it's Black and brown people who are going to end white supremacy. I was and I got to this point where I was just well, this is I don't even know what white supremacy is. Actually, I don't know. I know what the impact of this violence is, and my ancestors know that, right? But I'm not going to end white supremacy until I actually end my loyalty to white supremacy. White people have to do their work. Just for us, I'm saying in my case, as a cisgender, male-identified person, my work also includes undoing patriarchy, as well, the ways in which that's been deeply indoctrinated into my mind and body. That's work, right? And it's not supposed to be fun or comfortable. It's work. Work is what is. is what is. Stop making it good or bad. It's just what I do. Like I work. We just do that. Right? And you have to, I mean, getting back to grief, right? It's just like, again, restating this, I have to let go of believing that this is who I am, because it's not. And as long as I keep believing that I am the trauma and I am the grief, I am the rage, then I'm just actually buying into the ways in which white supremacy actually keeps me in my place. It is hard, impossible to experience fluidity and movement when you are identifying with something that is inherently really heavy and expansive. So I promised earlier, again, so 2 things. Please check out the pinned comment, and that is going to be an introduction to the, or information about the next event that I'm doing around this. So this is kind of like an introduction. And secondly, this will be posted on the timeline. So don't worry, this is going to be posted. Right after this, as long as I don't fuck it up and erase it, like I've done in the past. I'm going to get it. I think, I'm going to get it on the timeline. It will be there. And also, and just lastly, take a look at the link. And also any questions. So if there are any questions, I guess we have about 7 or 8 minutes. So if there are any questions that I can kind of give some insight into, please go ahead and put those there, and just write in the comments there. I'm going to light some more incense. So again, just restating this, when I'm doing really intense emotional labor work, particularly working with grief, I was actually working with a lot of grief this morning. Just some grief around my queer ancestry and so forth. But when you're doing this kind of work, just really offering incense in the space. Okay, here's a question. Do you teach a course on this? Yes. So if you take a look at the link, I taught a formal course last year on grief called Going to the Lonesome Valley, which some of you were a part of. This year, beginning in about 2 weeks, we're going to have a series of talks and workshops, including, I think, 2 half-day retreats for BIPOC folks. So just take a look at that link below, and they'll give you more information about where we're heading next. All right. And also, for those of you who have been joining in, please stay hydrated as well. This is just really just basic things around grief work. Hydrate. If you can, light some incense, maybe take a walk, get some fresh air. This is part of the work of grief, and relating to the impossible grief is learning how to take care of your grief. Not just trying to get through it, not just trying to get over it, but when it arises, we take care of it and we ask the grief, what does it need? What do you need? Literally, what do you need? Okay, the work seems overwhelming. Any suggestions on how to get through it? Calling in your help. Calling in your help. Always. We have to reverse this narrative that I'm helpless or that aren't enough resources. We are really well resourced because of colonialism. We've lost a lot of belief in the unseen world, the spirit world, or the bardo, depending on what path you're coming out of, is full of resources, full of beings who are well resourced, but we have to start calling those beings into our practice. I have to, like, for instance, I've been calling Harriet Tubman into my practice, which is a being who's very present right now, whose consciousness is really awakened for us. I just turn my mind into Mother Harriet, right? I turn my mind into Marsha P. Johnson. I turn my mind towards, who did I turn my, to my teachers, my teachers who passed on, right? I turn my mind to Sojourner Truth. I turn my mind, into James Baldwin, Toni Morrison. I just use these beings are still with us. They're still with us. These were great beings whose work in the living world reflected immense realization, So you remember, right? You remember. So when I feel really overwhelmed by the grief, when I've lost connection to everything that I've been talking about, I go back and I ask for help. I just pray and I ask for help. And we need to get back into prayer. It doesn't matter what you believe. Actually, a secular, like this really intense secular mind frame isn't going to get you free, because the world is extremely much more dynamic than a secular worldview. And we have to get hip to that. When people say, I don't believe in this, I don't believe in that, that's fine, but ultimately we need to believe that there's something else than this. There's more going on than this, right? And we need to figure out a way to be in a relationship to what we don't immediately see. I know everyone wants to be an abolitionist right now, but what Harriet Tubman taught me about abolition is that if you're not praying, you're not actually interested in getting free. Because freedom is a collaboration between the physical world and the unseen world, right? And we need to, for modern abolitionists, even if it's prison abolition, police abolition, doesn't matter what it is, you need to be praying, If we want to disrupt the carceral state, we actually need to start praying for the spiritual resources, because I promise you the people who are really invested in the carceral state are also praying, and they're not praying to beings of light. They're praying to darker beings, darker forces, and we have to see this as spiritual warfare. All of this, my grief is a form of spiritual warfare right now. Working with my grief is warfare. This is a war. This is what you're experiencing. This is war. Okay, so please join me. Again, I want to kind of end there before we get shut off, but please join me for the event below that's pinned. Please join my website, my newsletter, to get more information about what I'll be offering in the next couple of weeks, particularly around grief and BIPOC communities, right? So I just want to say that whatever we've done together, whatever great liberatory energy that we've awakened, that I pray that we just dedicate this energy out to all beings right now, because we all need it to begin to disrupt systems of abuse and power and violence, to end systems of famine, to begin to disrupt violent legislation that keeps many of us from getting the resources that we need, that all of this is disrupted and people remember who they are, right? People remember their love, their compassion, their kindness, right? Not the darkness, not the meanness. Okay. And I pray for all of you, too, that you get what you need, and that you've gotten some of what you need in this session, and that you keep doing the work, all right? All right, thank you so much. Again, there's a question box here. Anyway, we'll get to that later. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, and I will see you again soon. All right, thank you.